Good afternoon, everyone. Buena tarde y buena hora. Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
The gentleman is now repeating it in Catalan. My name is Eduardo Maura, and I'm going to be moderating this panel entitled Cultural Work Guaranteed Precariousness. It's asked as a question, pending response. It's not a statement. Very briefly, before presenting the people who are going to participate in this panel, I'd like just to set the scene briefly, talking about what I consider to be the most important issues today. At a conference, at a meeting like Culturopolis, I believe that it's important to remind us of something which is basic, but something that we should always bear in mind. And that is that there's nothing in the DNA of culture, there's nothing in the genesis of culture like work. I mean, culture is many different things, and the definitions of culture are diverse and many. Some of them are contradictory and conflictive, but amongst this diversity, without a doubt, culture is a job, it's work. That's one of the definitions of culture, and there's nothing in the DNA of culture as work. Which means that it has to be precarious. It doesn't have to be. It's a question of policy, of social frameworks. It's a question of tackling the issues and proposing solutions. You don't need to work under precarious conditions when you work in the cultural sphere. It's important. Nobody is cursed. There's no kind of curse. There's no original sin in culture, meaning that our existence has to be precarious. And that's something we need to remember each and every day of our lives. That's very obvious. And it takes me then to a second idea, which I believe to be important to mention, and which I believe could serve to set the scene, as I say, for this panel. It's what I understand is that cultural work is key to cultural rights. There's no division, there's no compartmentalization there. Cultural rights and cultural work. I think it's the opposite. Cultural rights have to be in the middle of cultural democracy, following the terminology used in the Porto Santo meeting. In the Charter of Porto Santo, and I think we should remember this as a work in progress, that we don't particularly talk of cultural work. The word work appears as network, framework, or working paradigm, but they never talk about cultural work. The Charter is wonderful in many senses, but in this respect, cultural work, I think there's still a long way to go with what it says. I was saying that cultural work should be key to cultural rights. In my opinion, cultural, dignified, stable cultural work is central to cultural democracy, full cultural rights. If cultural work is not dignified, is not stable, isn't painful for the individuals, for the bodies of the people who work in it, both their physical and mental health is damaged. If it's not dignified, cultural projects become far less diverse. There are less and they are less viable. And those that emerge are conditioned more by external players, by pressures and short-term vision. They emerge in a far less vital, less diverse way than they would have done if the people working in culture had worked under better, more dignified conditions. For cultural production, distribution, mediation, if working conditions are not dignified, it means less independence, and it means worse and less culture. And we have to say that loud and clear. A precarious cultural sector implies precarious cultural rights. Let me give you an example, a comparison, and I'll wind up with this. When healthcare deliverers work under precarious conditions, not only do they suffer the conditions of work, both in their mental and physical health, the rights of all citizens suffers if my doctor, my GP, is in a precarious situation. It affects my rights to health. If the system, the health system, is precarious, all citizens are affected, not just the people employed under the system. And in my opinion, it's the same in cultural work. A cultural worker in precarious conditions is a lesion. It is a wasting of cultural rights, wasting in the sense of wearing away. It would lead us to less autonomous, less viable, less diverse culture. This is wearing away our culture. It's not only, if it's precarious, does it affect the cultural workers, but all. And I think this is important as a frame for reflection and as a working frame. To talk about this, I've got 6 people with me today, and I'm going to put out 2 questions to them. But before doing that, as an initial approach to the problem, there's something I want to announce.
I will make this announcement in English. There's cultural workshop hosted, led by Cultural Action Europe, that will take place in Sala 6 at El Molino, very close, at 5 o'clock today, 5 o'clock. And I think that you really should join them. You really should join the Cultural Action Europe people today at 5. The room capacity is 40 people, okay? No more than 40, but no less than 40 either. So please join them. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to be there because I think it really complements. It's really good to keep the conversation going, to move forward with this conversation. 5 o'clock at El Molino, please. 2 questions, 2 preguntas, perdón.
Sorry, back to English. 2 questions for the 6 speakers. First, do you believe that the conversation on cultural work in your sector, in your country, in your area is as relevant as it should be or could be? Or do you believe that the terms of the dialogue are not adequate? Do you believe that it is being discussed as it warrants or not? The way people talk about cultural work in your particular environment, and in terms also of public intervention. In terms of the public sphere, because we have people from different levels of administration, what do you believe to be the priorities for the public sphere in the cultural area? How do you believe it should operate at all levels in the area of cultural work? Broad questions, as you know, just to start the ball rolling. Let me introduce you in the order that they're going to answer the questions to the members of our panel, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience, and you can also address each other after your first round. With us today, then, we have Catherine Magnan, who comes from the European Commission. She's Assistant Director and Head of the Cultural Policy section of the European Union. We've got Noel Kelly, who is the Director of Visual Artists Ireland. We have Montserrat Molinet, who is President of the Artists of Catalonia Assembly platform. We have Floristak, who is from the Belgian government. We have Jana Moneda, who is president of the Jazz Musicians and Musicians of Catalonia and also chair of the Union of Musicians. We also have Emma Rodriguez, who is a professor from the University of Vigo and also works with the Department of State, and Kwame Berre, and Yolanda Diaz, who is vice president from the government. Thank you all very much. Welcome. Catherine, please, would you kick things off?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks for inviting me. So, your first question is a discussion on cultural rights, cultural work, is going in the right direction? Well, I'm working for the European Commission, so the European level, and my answer would be, I'm glad that it's going, quite simply. I'm glad we're having a conversation. It was not the case a few years back. for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that everything that concerns pay, remuneration, social security, taxation is in the sphere of what states, countries, so the members of the EU, can do. There is almost no scope for acting at European level. But then COVID took place, and that was, as you know, a major shock for culture and the cultural and creative sectors and the workers, the artists, the cultural professionals, and that has changed everything. Now this issue is being discussed at European level. I don't know whether we should be pleased or not, because COVID was a tremendous loss and tremendous shock, but well, that's where we are, and at least the issue is now has come to the fore. And if you don't mind, maybe I can give a few figures just to you know, to set the debate, you know, to paint the landscape in a way. So when it comes to people employed in the cultural and creative sectors in the EU, it's more or less 7 million people. And it's like, you know, 4% of people employed in the EU, 4% of employment. And we know it's much more, because we know there are a lot of artists who have alimentary, you know, jobs to pay the bills that are not cultural jobs, so they are not in those statistics. We also know that there are a lot of people who work undeclared. So 7.4 million people work in the cultural sector in the EU, but it's more. Now, what's interesting with COVID is that for the statistics, the official statistics at EU level, between 2013 and 2019, cultural employment kept growing. And of course, with COVID, unfortunately now, you know, they have calculated the loss, so how many people have left the sector, and in the official statistic, it's minus 10%. Between 2019 and 2021, 100,000 people have left the cultural and creative sectors in the EU. And so that's, you know, I mean, those people having chosen not to be artists or cultural workers anymore, it of course goes together with the losses that the sector has occurred during COVID. So here again, a few figures at European level. There has been a decrease of 35% in royalties collected in the last 2 years. In music venues, we have, you know, a musical association here. It's, you know, minus 76% attendance. Museum, minus 80% revenues. So a major crisis for the sector. And that's what has led us to start discussing those issues. Before that, it was very difficult to get attention at European level. And what we observe are two things. First, at national level, we see an increasing number of countries that are reflecting on the status of an artist, and some have adopted a status for the artist, like Portugal, whereas they didn't have one before. And other countries like Romania, the Czech Republic are reflecting on having one. But that's, you know, I mean, there are more movements. Maybe I should leave the floor to my colleagues to explain what's happening in their countries. Very interesting stuff happening in Ireland, a fairness process in Austria and the Netherlands. I mean, this is unheard of. And we're also trying to see what could be done at European level. But I don't know whether I should say everything now or whether you want to have a second round of discussion. So I'm in your hands.
No, please go.
Sorry?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Noel, please.
I had started with, you know, does art pay as the cliched question, and I had the usual cliche answer. But I suppose really the real question is, when have artists not been in crisis? And this is something that Visual Artists Ireland has reflected on over the years. And before I arrived, there were many campaigns and many discussions. And the reason why I want to set some of this context, because the answer to the question of, you know, has the language changed? It's actually been utterly transformed in Ireland, but it's been transformed by a series of events, and I'd like to discuss just some of the events. probably around 2006, 2007, the language of the visual arts organizations and cultural organizations in general were based on anecdotes. They were based on sad stories. They were based in a language that was emotive. They were based in a language that could be ignored as poetic, as creative. So one of the first important things that we did in VAI was we decided to play the game. And we created a moment, a survey called The Social, Economic and Fiscal Status of the Artist in Ireland. And we really enjoyed making up one of those titles that none of us really understood what it meant, but we knew that an economist would pay attention to us. As we were doing this survey, once again we were getting lots of policymakers and lots of politicians, once again telling us wonderful stories about the importance of the arts, the importance of artists, and wouldn't they be doing it anyway? There was such a complete and utter disrespect. So we decided we would start to publish publicly the figures. So the first figure that we published was about artists' incomes. But we didn't just give them a percentage. We made the statement 68% of artists who have a second job to support their career or have family supporting them live under the poverty threshold in Ireland, which was at the time €10,480. And the minute we used the word poverty, and the minute that we used the statistical poverty threshold, that didn't look good, because everybody understood what that meant. The person, the cleaner, the taxi driver, everyone understood what the poverty threshold was. So all of a sudden they could understand what we were talking about. We were no longer emotional creatives. We were actually sort of telling them something that they could see. What this led to was a big campaign called Ask, Has the Artist Been Paid? That campaign went for about 2 years. We had the badges, we had the tote bags, we had everything. But what the result of that campaign was that the main funders introduced a condition of all of their funding, that all projects that are publicly funded by the main funders in Ireland must pay artists. So this was completely and utterly transformative, because up till that there was no right to be paid. How this then started to change was it took from 2013 to 2020 for this to be turned into an official policy of the Arts Council. And I will say, I should explain, Visual Artists Ireland, we work both in the Republic of Ireland and also Northern Ireland. So therefore the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, as the main funder there, also adopted. So we had a UK body adopting it as well. Key issue with it was, though, there was no enforcement. The institutions that were being funded had to show in their applications that they were paying artists in an equitable way. And at a later stage, there would be maybe, a report to show money had been spent. But there was no way for us to sort of do anything about when we discovered artists not being paid, because it wasn't universally adopted very quickly. We gave 3 years for it to be adopted, and even after the 3 years, we found institutions coming to us and saying, we can never pay artists. And the reasons we were given were so completely crazy. One of the reasons was that our board of directors doesn't believe in that. We don't have to. We'll get away with not paying them. They'll do it for nothing. And if they don't do it for nothing, I have another artist over here who'll do it. They'd be glad of the work. And the most crazy one was, I don't know how to use Excel to change my budget spreadsheet. That was genuine reason given to us. You can imagine our comments at the time weren't really repeatable. So all of this is leading up to COVID. We're coming into the COVID moment. And COVID was the moment when actually the conversation was utterly transformed. And it's not very often that you will find people in our office bursting into tears. But there was a moment when COVID, when the lockdown came, and our advocacy had gone to the various funding bodies, and we asked, please protect the artists, please protect the artists. The first policy that was passed is that every artist who was contracted, whether or not it was a formal signed contract or a verbal contract, who was contracted to do work during the restricted times, must be paid as if they had delivered the work. It was incredible. All of a sudden, we had a government who actually really, really believed in us. Also coming just before COVID, we had done some work with the Irish government about job seekers allowance or social welfare benefits. And they created a special scheme for artists, which, I mean, it's very like the ordinary social protection. It just has some very specific terms. But what was really important about it was that nowhere in Irish law is the artist defined. We have tax exemption on creative works, so we could define what a creative work is, even if it's seen through a 19th century colonial viewpoint, but that's okay. Installation artists really don't stand a chance. But in the middle of, there was no other definition. Social welfare came to us and they said, how would we recognize an artist? Who are they? So we basically went to we are the National Committee for the IAA in Ireland, and we went to them with the definition used for the IAA. And they agreed this would now be the definition recognized. But the problem came. We have been working in partnership with the writers' representative body, and therefore they introduced and copied some of our systems, so writers were okay. But no other creative was, because none of the other representative bodies had a pure definition of who their artists were. So now I've only 2 minutes. I will go into the good things of COVID, which, once again, it's really horrible talking about good things in COVID. But what happened was that not only were the artists being paid, but also a series of special schemes were being created almost on a weekly basis, and they were all directed towards the individual artist. It didn't always work properly. We are now coming out the other side, and we are starting to see some Pyrrhic victories. Arts organizations are saying that the programs that they cancelled, they now have to catch up on them, so therefore they have decreased the number of new opportunities that are being made available to artists. So whilst the artists were being protected during COVID, the precarity has actually got worse, even though we had all those supports, because the future work is diminished. If I were to just take one moment of looking at what are the key challenges that we see, we look at some of the EU directives that arrive in Ireland, and in particular we have the Artist Resale Right Directive which arrived. The pressure on national governments is to implement the directive, but there is no measurement of how the directive has been implemented in terms of its impact within our society. So, for example, the artist resale right was introduced very, very quickly. The Department of Enterprise owns it, not the Department of Culture, and the threshold was at €3,000 rather than the €1,000 that was more prevalent around the country. There is no obligation on, there is no dedicated collecting society mentioned or mandated in it, even though there is a mandated collection society. So therefore, what we are seeing now, and the news, as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, the statistic in Ireland, and please remember we are a small country with a very small art market, but the EU directive that meant to do so good, because it has no teeth, Irish artists are due €325,000 in unpaid artist resale right because we can't enforce it because of the way it comes from Europe.
Thank you, Noel. Thanks a lot. Montserrat, por favor.
Gracias.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you up to now for what you've said. And I'm from the Association of Artists. The 2008 financial speculation crisis here in Catalonia in Spain led us to a level of precariousness and fragility in the structures, the basic grassroots structure, excuse me. Basically in 2008, when everything collapsed, I mean, with the pandemic, nobody was blamed. In Spain, the narrative in 2008, with the population, was that people and artists had lived beyond their means. And that's why the system collapsed, because nobody took responsibility. The government didn't, with everything that had happened with the bank collapse. The difference with COVID and the pandemic was that everyone was locked away at home, and the fact that we were all seeing each other on screen created a more equitable situation. Everybody seemed to be equal, and people's ability to listen meant that at the end of the day we started looking at the fact that artists needed help, needed aid, depending on their personal situation. And despite that, if we're talking about figures, most visual artists in Spain earn equal to or under €6,000. So, you know, I mean, obviously above the poverty line that Noah mentioned, but this excluded many people because all of the aids that was to help them through their suffering were based on whether or not these people were registered as self-employed workers, and anybody that was not registered as a self-employed person, a freelancer, was then not eligible for any kind of help. And this meant that artists' associations and unions, started to make a stand against that. But also I think things had changed, the pandemic has affected us all, and this has had a levelling effect. The serious problem that we have in Spain and in Catalonia is the want of contracts, the lack of regulation of cultural work, and most particularly artistic work. It's very hard to gauge because the quality is always subjective of whether we consider something to be a work of art or not. But this has an effect over time and affecting precariousness when we see that we as artists in Spain do not have an option to contribute to the social security system. Here in Spain, 83% of artists in Spain have paid their social security contributions for less than 3 years. So remember the level of anxiety, anguish that the artist must feel, you know, in order to be able to pay social security contributions for this minimum of 35 years, as it is in Spain. We in our association have made a call for contracts. We've brought out a guide of best practices that most institutions, at least here in Catalonia, have endorsed, but we are wanting in forms to control to ensure that these best practices were actually followed. At the end of the day, everything was solved with grants, research grants, creativity grants, but they do not make social security contributions. So we've got the paradox that if you don't have some kind of financial backing, somebody that's looking after you, you don't have the right to artistic or creative practice. We believe that this meritocracy that we've developed has to be erased because, you know, it says that yes, you can get there if you're talented, talented, but really it's cloaking, it's not true, it's cloaking, what's the word, I can't think of it, it's coming to me, class privilege, a kind of cult class privilege. And so this means that we have winners and losers and doesn't regulate artistic practice.
Amidst this disaster with climate change and the many things that governments need to resolve, the governance revolving around contemporary culture is complicated because it always ends up... I mean, what tells you what a work of art is or isn't? It's very subjective, right? So we cannot rely on regulation in this regard. Rereading a text published by Nuria Güell, an artist called The Artist and the person from the fruit store, and the greengrocers say that anything responding to the needs of artists and regulating their labor practice is so difficult to agree on because the purpose of the work is confusing. The purpose is not that of the work of art. Nobody knows what that consists of, but rather covering the demand of the cultural industry. And when we talk about this demand, and when we think on big public institutions, we should revisit the budgets as well to see where these budgetary items go to. Just to give you an example, the Magba Museum in 2020, the year of the pandemic, had a budget of 11.5 billion. Sorry, apologies, I'm making a mistake with my numbers. 11.5 billion, 1.5 of which were for the production of exhibitions. So 13.9% of the budget was earmarked to the creation by artists. So I'll continue in the next round of questions. Thank you, Montse.
Floris, you will be showing us a presentation, won't you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to give a short introduction to a Belgian project of the national government that's called Working in the Art, and it's to level up the social and economic conditions of the art workers in Belgium. So, okay. So my colleague on the left, Tom Kessens, couldn't be here for personal reasons, but I guess quite some people in the room are acquainted with him. And in the middle we have some members of parliament, because it's a project that's not only brought into reality by the government itself and by all the different ministers, but also by all the different factions in parliament. And I think the main condition to make this whole thing into a success was the fact that the national government started off during COVID. And I'm not going to elaborate on the difficulties of COVID for cultural workers, but let's say that across the board, from extreme left to almost extreme right, everybody agreed that there was a real big problem on the long run for cultural workers. So at the same time that we were working on temporary measures to make sure that people could afford their living, their daily life living, we started working on long-term measures to reform the whole framework, the whole regulation framework for cultural workers. So the government came to be the new national government in October 2020, and this was our engagement we took towards the cultural workers, and more importantly, we added also money in the basket, because the national government for now was spending 80 million recurrent every year on cultural workers' conditions, social and economic ones, and we added 75 million. So we almost doubled the budget, and that's recurrent, that's for infinity until the next government decides to do otherwise. Not going to go into these, to be short enough. Interesting thing about Belgium, and I'm sure many people recognize that from their own countries, we are a very difficult state. We have different types of states, and then we have the national level, which means we have to share competences. Some things we can do, some things we can't. What we can't do is what you see on the right. That's everything regarding to employment policies. That's for the regions. Everything regarding cultural policies is for the communities. So then people ask, so what are you going to do on the national level? You're not responsible for employment, you're not responsible for cultural policies. And I think that was actually a gift for us, because then we looked at what are we responsible for? We're responsible for social security, taxes, labor law, economy, pensions, and so we said we're going to work on all of them, but not on cultural policy. And we're going to see how we can level up the social and economic conditions of the cultural workers. How are we going to do this? First of all, the cultural sector. My colleague comes from the cultural sector. I'm new to the cultural sector since 4 or 5 years. There's a lot of people with strong opinions. There's a lot of people with different opinions, and there's a lot of people that voice their opinions. So if we want to do anything, we have to get everybody on board and take into account all of the different opinions and all of the different realities of all of the different disciplines. Not very easy. So we made a co-creation project. We had a participation project that was very broad. It was online. Everybody could contribute, which meant some things were very valuable, other things were not. But it was selected and worked through by a technical group of people, and that were 30 people from different parts of Belgium, different disciplines. And they had to be our reference board. Every few weeks we saw them, and whatever measure we brought up, they would react to us. They would say, this is not good, this should be better. And so we had like piecemeal engineering on many different measures together with the sector. And one thing we already brought to Parliament, and normally next week it's going to be voted, is this very difficult system on a slide that's not very well graphically reworked, as I see. People have a unique application. As a cultural worker, you can go to the administration and you put out your file and you prove that you're a professional cultural worker. Then you might get, and that's the WITA attestation, WITA stands for Working in the Arts, then you might get an all areas pass. What does this mean? You will be recognized as a professional culture worker. And whatever administration you go to, whatever competence, wherever in Belgium, they will have to recognize you're a professional cultural worker, and they will apply specific rules to you. Because the difficulty we had before, we had some specific rules, but every administration had its own way of saying, yes, this might be cultural, you might be professional, but I'm not sure, please provide more documents. So now we have one institution, and it's an institution, the one you see on top, that's ruled by a commission that's mainly peer-reviewed. 50% of people are from the sector, the other 50% are 1/3 labor unions, 1/3 employers, and 1/3 experts in social security. Once your file gets approved, you get for 5 years, without any questions asked access to all different specific rules for cultural workers. And on the bottom, you see a few of these specific rules that are already in place. We have specific benefits allowances. It's some sort of unemployment system, but it guarantees it's not a basic income. It guarantees that in months you don't have any income, we'll top it up until you have 1,600 euros, which means you can have long-term planning, you can have a family life, you can perhaps buy an apartment, and you can work on long-term projects and focus on your creative work without having to worry to live in poverty or to not make ends meet next month. A second specific thing linked to the attestation is you have 1-bis contracts. This means you work as a self-employed, but you register your self-employed contract that can take any form. You register as if you were an employee, and you pay social security contributions as if you were an employee. And in that sense, you will be covered by social security for employees, which is a lot larger than for self-employed people. It's a free choice. You can work as a self-employed, you can work as an employee, or you can work in this hybrid statute that we want to elaborate to more people. A third specific rule is for starters. If you start a new career as an artist for the first 2-3 years, you will pay less contributions, but you will be fully covered by social security. This to make sure you invest all the money you earn in making ends meet and in your practice to develop to have more income on the long run. In the future, we see different projects still going, because every few months we go to Parliament to introduce new laws. And one of these is collective bargaining. We'll introduce collective bargaining with minimum remuneration and safety conditions for self-employed, 1-bis, and employees, all together without any distinction. This would be the first time in Belgium we have this kind of collective bargaining for self-employed people. I'm not going to get into this one. It's about copyrights. We're also doing a lot of that. And also here, and for the future, whoever has a good idea about saying, yeah, okay, this rule, it's not cultural policy, but perhaps for the reality of cultural workers, we need to have some adapted rules. It's very easy. Everybody with a wristband, all areas, you can enter and you will have specific conditions. So we hope that in the future, this whole system in place will make sure that we continue to be modernizing the system to take into account the different realities of cultural workers. And perhaps the last slide is a call to action. The Belgian government will preside the European Council in the first half of 2024. It's the last presidency of European Council before European elections, so we want to set the agenda for the next Commission, and we want to make one of the highlight projects of the Belgian European presidency the focus on social and economic conditions of cultural workers. So not necessarily cultural policy, but anything around it that will make sure that people can focus on their creative work and don't have to worry to make ends meet at the end of the month.
Thank you. You've all been amazing, using your time wisely. I love you very much. All of you. Thank you, Floris, Guillem.
Sí, hola, buenas tardes.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm impressed of what you just said, because if this is happening, this is what we in Spain are already trying to implement with the Statute of the Artist, and we'll get to that in a minute. But that is the goal, to endow artists with this context, where they only need to be worried about doing their work. Any employee should have to do that, you know, just working and not worry about the precariousness that affects artists by and large. It's almost congenital, isn't it? Now, let me give you some data to illustrate this. We did a survey. I mean, data is one of the things that is lacking, I believe, from artists. We are lacking reliable data that show what the state of the profession is like. So we did a survey in 2021, in the middle of, halfway during the pandemic. It cannot be considered as reflecting reality, but it shows the data that has been mentioned. 88% of those that did the survey did not reach the minimum income, 14,000 euros a year. Musicians can be freelancers, self-employed, or also employees. But out of these 88%, 69% was below half of that. That is below 7,000 euros a year in income resulting or stemming from all of their professional or artistic activities, that is live performances or the money received from copyright. Another important piece of information is that 67% declared that usually they earned less than 200 euros per show, and 64% said that every year they had less than 40 performances a year. In addition, important of note is parity. Only 1 in 4 people responding to this survey were women. So we already see a context that beyond the world of musicians can be extrapolated to other artistic disciplines. In Spain, there is a sector that is still far from reaching equality or gender equality. There are still many more men than women with very low income levels and also discontinuity in relation to remunerated work. Not the work that is done at home, of course, but there is no way of getting paid for that, especially if it's a self-employed worker. According to this data, according to this context, we clearly see an answer to the question posed in this table. A short insecurity? Well, my answer would be yes. This is inherent to the condition of being an artist in this country, I'm afraid. And how can we address this situation? Is this country taking this seriously? I think it is. And this started with the pandemic. As Montserrat said, when we were all connected, we were able to get things that we had not managed to get before, such as specific unemployment benefits for artists that was out of the usual context, recognizing precisely the specificity of artists, which is different to that of other workers, including technical experts or cultural workers that are affected by these same conditions, these same provisions as well. They are part of the same level of work as artists, I'm trying to say, without being artists. So this is already a key piece. Another key piece of this is that 4 years ago, in 2018, a report was approved in Congress in preparation of the statute of the artist. Kim Maura, present here, was one of the promoters of that proposal, and it let the foundations of what my colleague just said, creating a special statute for artists so that they could come out from this situation of precariousness. During the pandemic, we were unable to work on that, but after it, we can. And one thing the government has done well is to include this within the recovery plan, so that with the European funds, we can implement a measure to carry out a structural reform along with the labour law, to receive these funds and be able to promote this. It was good for us because the pace of the meetings that are being held at the level of the central government, because the powers lie with the central government, tax matters, labour matters, and social security matters are all centralized in Madrid. And from there, they're doing good work. So the administration is hands-on. The conditions are there to be able to have this statute. And on the other hand, representatives and associations are also playing a role. We need to reflect on it. Is the country ready? It may be. But are we, the artists, ready to reach these spaces that are being created for negotiation with the competent ministries to be able to carry out all of these negotiations? With the pandemic, things got accelerated. It was unavoidable. We didn't have anything else. Those of us, artists and cultural workers, had no other chance but to organize meetings. So there was a lot of production, a lot of meetings, many initiatives. We can recall Alerta Roja, Red Alert, a national initiative that just put on top of the table the lack of measures. But the group of artists need to be aware that this is a very long-term initiative, long-term work, and we need to be ready at an associative level, not only in each community. In Spain, because of the way we organize things in the country, there are things that are negotiated in Madrid, so we need to be federated to carry out all of these meetings and be able to have the proposals ready and negotiating them. Because, as I said, this is a long-term job. This is something we are lacking, at least in the world of music. Historically, we have not been well organized. I'm making a little bit of self-criticism here. So the change needs to start with the artists. We know our reality the best. And we are the ones who need to make the step to convey to the administrations what our needs are. We need them to understand us, and we need whatever is built to adapt to our needs. Even if there are some recommendations issued by some commissions, everything will need to be enacted in a legislation which will be complex and has been seen many times. It has defects in application, and that is where associations play an important role. Thank you. Thank you, Guillem. Emma? Well, being the last has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that I have too many topics I could talk about that have been mentioned and which I would love to talk about. The disadvantage is that I need to answer a question. Are we conversing? Are we in talks with the Ministry of Labour and Social Economy? Are we conversing with the artists? After listening to my colleague on my right, it is obvious we are conversing and talking. I was joking to him, and I was telling him earlier, I speak to him more often than I do to my friends and family. That's a reality, actually. But this is an obligation because of my position, and I truly believe there is a need This is something the ministry and the government believes in. That's why there's component 24 that comes after component 23, which includes the labor reform and all of those modifications in labor relations. So after that, we will be developing the statute of the artist. So where are we coming from? I was listening to the Belgian colleague, and I saw myself reflected in his remarks. We have been in talks with many associations of professionals in the world of culture. We continue to talk to them, and we will continue to talk to them. This has been key, so that not only from a technical point of view, but also from a more practical perspective, we can have what Guillem was asking for. Precisely something that we discussed, something we witnessed not that long ago in a recent meeting. It is very important that cultural workers see themselves as workers with rights, who want dignified work. This is something that we say to all workers in this country because of what the ILO says. And people in the cultural sector are no different. As you said, Edu, you do not have a cross on your backs. On the contrary, you have a magic wand. You were touched with the gift of creativity, and you apply your knowledge to our daily reality. It helps us all live better lives. So, this is rather theoretical, but I am saying this because I want you to consider that in January, during the pandemic, precisely when this government, when Joaquín Pérez gave the numbers for unemployment, he said, "What have I done to deserve this? What have I done to deserve this horrible unemployment numbers?" Because they were. This was only the beginning of the term of office of this government, and the situation was horrible. The pandemic came along and many decisions were made in a hurry, as you well said, to ensure that workers would not have to pay for the healthcare crisis because they were not to blame for it. On the contrary, they had to be protected. Everybody had to be protected. That is what the government had to do, and that was made clear in all respects. That is why, in May that year, there was a special royal decree recognizing this unemployment benefit, a specific benefit recognized for people in the world of culture because they could not work. All of this meant that when we implemented and when we were able to approve in a social dialogue table a year ago the labor law, a labor law we had clear in our minds that affected all workers in this country, we had an alarming precariousness, poverty rates among young people, temporary contracts, all of those things that you already know and that are well known, unfortunately were so obvious in society, and in the sector of culture it was more so or even worse. It affected creators, and it affected technicians and all workers in this industry. The reality was difficult, and all of these problems were heightened in the world of culture. I'm referring to vulnerabilities, because this sector, the cultural sector, is very special, like many others are. That is why we did a labor reform, bearing in mind the current times, and when we tried to put an end to this precariousness in the various sectors, maybe, for instance, those in the house cleaning sector, but others as well. In some sectors there are situations that require some sort of special regulation. And when the labor law was enacted, we already contemplated we had to start with a social dialogue table with the cultural sector, because we had to avoid this new regulation negatively affecting your sector. I think we did it with the royal decree, I said, by and large, but I think we have made some progress. I'll just leave it there. You had 2 minutes more if you want to use them. Let me emphasize that we have numbers. It is in the reasoning of the law that nobody reads, but we do analyze this in detail. We give numbers and some things, well, you know, and there is a mention of what the cultural sector provides to the GDP. And the number is important. It is important for the purposes of putting into practice from 2 or 3 ministries, like is the case in Belgium. We have an interministerial commission promoting this statute of the artist. And it gives us strength when proposing it, when promoting it, and in a nutshell, when guaranteeing that these labor and social conditions that have already been mentioned, social security matters have been mentioned. I wouldn't like to refer to them because they're too technical, but it's important for this to be shown in real numbers. Let me say one more thing. You already said it. I'm a teacher, a lecturer. I really loved your intervention. So I would like to say that the position of workers in the cultural sector is very important, and the Court of Justice of the European Union, and now I'm putting the hat of lecturer, has ordered judgments of 2016 and 2018 stating that temporary work is applicable to musicians. In the jargon of professors referring to musicians, they say that the 1970 directive is applicable. These technical matters, which are not fun at all, value all of those matters that we truly want. Dignified working conditions for all workers in all sectors, each of them with their own specificities. We will need to work hard, maybe not trial and error, but we will make steps. Like in dance, you know, if there's someone who likes dancing, we will be taking steps, but we will move forward. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Right. Thank you, and all of you who intervened using your time wisely. Now, let me mention some of the topics that were mentioned to encourage dialogue between you. And I ask the audience to get any questions ready, because very soon we will open the floor for you. So many things have been mentioned. An important one is the centrality of the pandemic in this new central role of cultural work seen as actual work. This idea that artists and cultural workers don't want to be special, you know? We don't want to be the special ones. We want to be specific, but as specific or as special as other workers. Those working in an office, those working at sea, those working in the air, or those working in the various places where people work. Just that. The pandemic indeed placed us at the center, because it seemed that culture occupied an entirely different place in our lives in the context of a complete standstill in our existence. And what I would like to ask you, as people interested in culture gathering here today, is how can we make sure that the central role of culture is not an exception, but the norm? The new norm, normal. That's the first question. Now, second, I would like to tie this with the density of the associative fabric. It is obvious that in the various countries, in the various places and cities and towns, regions and villages, there is very different density. Density rates in associative fabrics are different. In some places there is a greater degree of associationism, but it is very different amongst those who are employees or those who are self-employed. There are many different circumstances occurring in the cultural labor market, such as the proliferation of false freelancers, promoted even by public administrations themselves, without willing to, in logics of outsourcing that ended up generating false freelancers in centers and cultural institutions. And this can only be overcome with associative work, and the density of the associative network is key. I am convinced that the density of the associative fabric is very important. We can see this in Belgium, we can see it in Catalonia, and we can see it elsewhere. Today, they're not here, but the European Parliament, in terms of legislation, has an open dialogue with trade unions. You know, legislative work at EU level is very important. Also in local governments, regional governments, national governments, there needs to be communication between unions and legislators at all levels. In the European Commission too, at all levels. With the executive and with the legislators. How do you believe we can improve this? How can we be better in organizing ourselves? And lastly, cultural precariousness is by itself unequal. It is easy to adopt a gender perspective and see how many big differences there are in cultural precariousness. And we can see the difference between men and women in this regard. We can see the difference in the access to provisions, to benefits. The way in which, for example, a woman who works as a self-employed artist has a different level of precariousness to that of a man. These are two different worlds. Working in the same sector, I mean, the only difference is being a man, being a woman, or working as an employee, or working as a self-employed. The differences between self-employed and employees and between men and women in the cultural sector is big. These are big problems. They have been mentioned, but I also wanted to refer to them again. And lastly, obviously, the technicians are also cultural workers on an equal footing to the artists. I would not like to forget or mentioning that those who help us put the microphones on, assemble the set, and organizing the trips, the hotel stays, and the needs of others. We are all here thanks to all of these first-rate cultural workers. They are first-rate cultural workers, I must say. So, any comments? If not, we can open up the floor. Just let me ask you about the special scheme. That's the term used by Spanish legislation, okay? The special schemes is the term used by Spanish legislation. Maybe we could think about changing it.
One of the things I realised that I didn't talk about was the basic income that has just been introduced as a pilot scheme. And I know that Terry would kill me for not at least mentioning it. It's a pilot scheme introduced to, first of all, I believe that without COVID it would not have been as easy to get this through, because the conversation about the individual artist and actually the worker, the cultural worker, those in the other precarious jobs that support our sector wouldn't be as much to the forefront. Two things. Number one, it's a pilot. It's 2,000 artists have been selected for 3 years. And during that time, they will receive up to €350 per week with no strings, except they have to write a really tedious, boring survey report at the end of each year. 1,000 artists have been selected to report on not receiving it, so therefore to give good measurement. The people who want to, there is opposition to it. There's sectors and very, very niche groups who don't want to see it work. Why don't they want to see it work? They can't see their own personal circumstance in it. Everything becomes very personal. There are certain, politicians or political parties who their position is to be the party of opposition. So therefore, that is their stance. So all of these are putting it in a very precarious position. But I think it's also important that the artists themselves, there's a percentage of the artists themselves that are putting it into a precarious position. And I note with all the panelists, we all talk about the artist, and we're all talking about supporting them in terms of their life and so on. But actually, they have other lives. They have lives as mothers and fathers. They have single parent. They have social needs, blind, deaf. All of the support mechanisms that we put in place put all of the other supports in jeopardy unless we actually develop them in dialogue between the different agencies of government required. And that's actually quite difficult because social welfare, medical benefits and so on, may be in other forms of legislation or in other forms of policy. So actually, us then trying to go in and saying, whilst we're not special, we do have a set of conditions that have been created in order to protect us in society. And we want to be treated as equal citizens. But please don't take away my free medical benefit. Please don't make me pay for my disabled child, etc., etc. We haven't been able in Ireland to actually get that link perfect yet. And I think that's one of the great challenges, that for all the conversations that we're having about how can we get government, we have to remember we also need to build bridges into all aspects of government so that it's truly equitable rather than we are building a utopia for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
A mi m'agradaria afegir això que has comentat.
I would like to add that in Catalonia, the Catalan government has conducted a pilot test with universal minimum income for all citizens. And probably as part of those that are chosen, there will probably be artists. But what I can say is that there was an important movement of demand, and we believe that one of the policies that would be helpful to consider what is common to us all is a basic unconditional universal income. That would be good for all citizenship, to be entitled to say no to certain job offers. And the artists, I would say, would feel part of this citizenship and would have more resources to exercise their right to creation without having to worry, as we have seen in the Netherlands.
I'm not going to hog this, but Ireland obviously is not unique in creating this because it's been in the Netherlands, it's been in Scandinavian countries and so on. And when I speak to my Scandinavian colleagues in particular, we also talk about what were the impacts of basic income. Even though they have a different term for it and so on, a lot of countries have it. And it is something that is allocated for a very specific number of years. But when it actually can work against culture is when their complacency is built into it. And actually the creative, shall we say, fervor actually suffers because the comfort level has been built in so that, basic income is designed, here's your base level, you want to build more on that. But actually in some countries it's been built in that, people get a very nice summer house down in the south of France for 15 years, on the level of some of it. So we have to actually draw a balance of what we are really asking for. We're really asking for the supports in order to build upon and do it in a way that is measured and I mean measured not in sort of like, calculated terms, but actually we consider all aspects of it and the impacts of it, the positive and the negative, and we are honest enough to talk about the negative impacts. Because when we talk about government policy, we always want to talk about positive impacts, just because we beg that we get it. But we also have to start looking at what can be the negative impacts of it as well.
Aquí t'asseguro que la renda bàsica que s'està plantejant...
Basically, the basic income proposed, minimum income, doesn't mean that people are going to live a comfortable life. I mean, with the inflation and things as it is, we're talking about 800-900 euro grant, which isn't going to, mean that people live in comfort, but will give people a degree of security. What you said about, what to do to change the situation. I think that it's very important to be aware of it, particularly with the question of how artists are paid for their work. Not just artists themselves, but the impresarios. If salaries don't go up, the wages don't go up, however much of guarantee we have, things aren't going to work out. There are different things. One thing is a regulation of the situation, and the other is the market, the prices, the cachet. We have to be aware that, here in Spain, I'm not sure what's going on in Europe, but from when I've been abroad, I think it's also a problem with an artist, but what is paid is too low. And I think that not only the public administration should be aware of that. In terms of music, they are the biggest to hire musicians, but also the musicians themselves have to demand more for our work because, the cost of living is going up. The retail price index in Spain has gone up by 10%. The fees paid have been at a standstill for decades. That's very important. And the other thing is that as artists, it's our responsibility to be aware of the rules that there are in place at the moment, not what we would like to see. If we are freelancers, self-employed, why are we that? I don't know, in Spain, as a musician, you have a specific problem. I'm not sure about the rest of Europe, but musicians and many of the artists are hired through billing streams. We have difficulty in, paying our social security contributions and things. We're hired by a company that hires us for one day, and, they pay our social security for one day and things. So until we, are able to change this situation, we're going to be stuck in this precariousness. And the first thing is we need to be aware of, the MO in our sector, the rules that we are ruled by, how we work with these rather botched situations that many of us are facing as artists and musicians, and then to reinforce our associations, because that is the only way we're going to be able to convince the administration of what our problems are. And if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it for us. Just like we artists, there are many other groups, collectives, that are making such calls. Many do not have the power of action, but we need to be able to get an association together, to work together. And I'm going to pick up the glove here. In March, with what we did, regulates the artist's contract. It's an exception that has been made basically to allow for such a working condition, which by definition is temporary employment. We don't know exactly how and how long this contract is going to last for. This definition of the work of the artiste, which is temporary, and we have made this exception because we don't want workers in the cultural sector to have more problems. Quite the opposite. I insist on this. I've tried to make it clear that there is this concept of a worker, and following on from what Guillaume was saying, bearing in mind that, you know, there hasn't been this improvement made. We've opened up this opportunity to, let's say, regularize all of the workers in the sector, those that want to see what their rights are, what they need to do to provide mechanisms, because moreover, I think it's also cancellation of a contract has been made more expensive, let's say, and there is a final clause which commits the interministerial commission to develop a legal framework for the artists, not just to provide a short-term solution, which is what we didn't want to happen, but to look in greater depth at it and to cover the fiscal situation, the social security situation, and other related areas, so that all of this moves forward together, and that needs more than the 5 months that we've taken up to now. Thank you. Flores?
You have the last word, literally the last word. And we're off. Lo siento muchísimo, nos hemos quedado sin tiempo.
I'm really sorry we've run out of time. We started a bit late, but at all events, I'm going to call you all to the workshop at 5, where we can work more on that, where we can ask specific questions. I'm really sorry that we did kick off late and that we're not able to finish any later, so you're not going to be able to ask questions. I'm sorry about that. Flores, please.
The inclusion of technical and support workers in the art sector. It used to be a statute of the artist in Belgium, and now we always talk about the art worker, which includes also functions that are technical or in support. But there's also a debate, where do you put the boundary? Because if you talk with the sector, everybody says, yeah, whoever considers himself or herself to be part of the sector should be part of the sector. So putting this boundary is something, as a government, you cannot really ask at the sector, but you should listen to all different points, and then you need to make a decision. And let's say the marker we put as the Belgian government for now is that everybody that has an effect on the artistic product will be included, regardless if it's an artist or a technical or a supportive function, as long as it has an impact. That also means, for example, a person mixing music, a person caring for the lights of a production, they are all included. But it also means that the person only making the electric cables, but hasn't got any impact on the artistic product, will not be included. And it doesn't mean that this person is not necessary for the production, but it just also, in legal terms, we need to always be able to explain why we have special rules. And these special rules, we explain them by all the special conditions in the sector. And it doesn't mean we're not doing anything for people that don't have any impact on the artistic product, but we want them to be fully recognized as employees with all other entitlements, because there's many other parts of society where there's difficulties in employment, and we want them to be included in the general rules. But to put the marker somewhere is a very important part of the debate, and we made it larger, but I'm sure if you ask people of the artistic sector, they would always say that it could have been larger, but at a certain moment you have the risk that you cannot, for the broader society, and also legally explain why a bigger and bigger group will have the special rules, and it risks imploding the whole system.
Yeah, it certainly is part of the conversation. It's a very thin red line between certain professions, certain works, and certain jobs, the three of them. Thank you very much. What? No sé si do you have the... You want to say something?
I mean, I can certainly talk, if that's... No, I mean, just to finish, to say that at European level, so as I said, you know, in the field of culture and in the field of, you know, pay, social security, etc., what we can do is super limited, only on copyright, because it's the digital single market. Could we have, you know, legislation that was negotiated with member states and then enforceable. But that's only part, that's for the copyright. All the rest, we cannot take legislation. So what do we do? Well, exactly that in a way. We put ministries of culture and ministries of employment together, and we've had an expert group for 2 years now, where those ministries first, they are sitting together at the table, and that's not often, culture and employment. And then, for one country, and then all the 27 representatives of EU member states sit together and they exchange good practices on, so what do you have? Do you have a status of artist? What did you do? What was the most important hurdle? How did you manage that? What did you recognize as an artist? Do you consider, people who set up lights and microphones as art workers or not? So that's what we call an exchange of good practices. And in those fields where we cannot legislate at EU level, well, that's the way to help still. And we are now going to set up a platform where all those exchanges can be kept and shared and reused. We're going to continue also convening those meetings of experts from both sides of the ministries in the whole of the next 3 years. We very much look forward to the Spanish presidency of the EU, followed by the Belgian presidency of the EU, because both of them are going to do something for artists' working conditions. We don't know yet what they're going to do, not exactly, but the intention is there, and that's fantastic, because we cannot move at EU level without, the political will of the countries, and that's essential. So I'm really, really looking forward to your presidencies, because we've got to keep the matter alive, the topic alive, so that it can progress, so that we can learn from experiments being undertaken in Ireland, as you said, with the basic income, but also in the Netherlands. In Austria, fairness processes are being tested, like for all public contracts employing artists, conditions are set of minimum pay, etc. Each time there is an official commission. So that's, part of the way the fairness process works in, it's not even the whole of Austria, it's Vienna, a few regions in Vienna, but, so we're going to learn collectively. And so that's what's happening. And now the European Parliament, in parallel, is asking for, I would like to see a European status for artists. Not all countries agree. That would be something super difficult to do. There is no real, legislative, basis to do that. But the debate is on. And the fact that the debate is on, and that was just impossible a few years back, is already something. So I believe that we are now going to co-create, in our workshop, what it could be. But I really would like to congratulate and tell you here, especially the colleagues in the room who are not in Brussels with us, how important the work of Culture Action Europe is. Because, they represent you in Brussels, and they talk with us, they talk with the Parliament, and we need that push. We need that type of, first it's essential. You don't do policies for people you don't know and don't speak with, and second, you can, collectively at national or European level only progress if there is, a bit of a tension, a bit of a push. So. Getting a European status of artists is really not a done deal, but certainly, reflecting on how this could be done, what we need together. The discussion itself is needed and healthy.
Yes, it is. Me dicen que nos hemos ganado unos pocos minutos.
I've been told that we've earned ourselves a few extra minutes.
Listen to two people in the room. Tenemos dos intervenciones que nos han concedido para poder dialogar brevemente con la gente del público. Por favor.
The gentleman is just repeating what he said in English before, that we can field a couple of questions from the public.
No se sent, ara sí. Okay.
We can't hear you. Now we can. Okay. Above all, I wanted to give visibility to the local facilities of the town, the cultural facilities of the city of Barcelona, where we represent over 2,500 workers, and to talk about the question of the artists. We program many shows, performing artists, visual artists, and oftentimes, the kind of budget we can get affects them. And we're talking about public facilities which are managed by private companies because the local authorities organize tenders. And with the budgets that we have, there is a degree of precariousness for the artists. We program documentaries, concerts, talks by authors. Our budget gets where it gets, and there's a domino effect. If we don't have the budget, we can't pay the artists, and it affects them. So, if there were an association, or if there were the regime that we've been talking about, that's on the one hand. And then we, the workers as cultural managers, of which we have a number here in Barcelona. I mean, ours is the most expensive town in Spain. We've lost purchasing power. I, like my colleagues, have been earning the same for the last decade, while the cost of living is increased enormously. And, we need to be able to improve this situation, because at the end of the day, it's a domino effect. If the public administration doesn't provide a budget to program, to manage culture, at the end, the content provided by the artists is affected. At the end of the day, if they're not able to earn a living, then the content wouldn't exist. Or if we managers do not feel adequately recompensed for our work, there is this precariousness, and in that case, our services will also be precarious. I just wanted to add that. And thank you very much to our panel of speakers. I'm going to follow on from Albert, talking about the technical staff who are also leading professionals, as you said. These people are mistreated at the moment. Because of the implication of the companies, and also it's the responsibility of the local authorities. These quality technicians are living in poverty, basically. They're earning a little bit more than the minimum salary, and that's by people paid by the authorities that are paying for this wonderful meeting we're having. But, at the same time here, there are serious cases of mistreatment of employees, people who are working to support culture. Hi, I'm Diana Ribas. I'm an EMP. And I'm also the coordinator of culture for the Cultural Committee of the Bersali Group. I just wanted to make two comments, things that haven't emerged and I think should be discussed when we're talking about cultural workers. I'd say three. Well, I've added one. The first is let's not, lose momentum. This is something we all have to do. The momentum of the European Statute of the Artist, I think that it's clear that we've got this moment in time, an open door to do it. We have an awareness, unfortunately, after COVID. Many member states are also looking at the statute of the artists. We have the commissioner with the agenda on the table, and I believe, and let me say, we have two upcoming presidencies with states that are supporting the statute of the artist. So we need to give a solid thrust to it. Then I'd like to make another couple of comments. One, also in terms of a European task, to open the door definitively. We know it's all long term, but over the coming mandates, to ensure that there is a recognition of the qualifications of all cultural workers. allowing for real mobility of cultural workers throughout the Union. It is far from the status that many people have in many other professional sectors. The cultural sector is really affected in terms of mobility around Europe. And lastly, just to say that we are also highly concerned, and particularly after the recent surveys after COVID, in terms of the freedom of artistic expression and how that is affecting the cultural sector and the work of cultural artists. Because, you know, we're seeing that we're living in a very tough world at the moment, a difficult world where there is a lot of breach of the freedom of artistic expression. Thank you to the organizers. It's been fascinating. It's a pleasure to see many of you here in Barcelona and not in the European Parliament. Thank you. Thank you. I've been told that we've got time to take one more question. I think there was somebody over there. Yeah?
Yes.
Out of the corner. A quick answer to a question, then the remarks. A press officer is included in the Statut d'Artiste or not? A press officer is included in the perimeter or is excluded as a definition?
I don't think a press officer will be included, as he doesn't have an impact on the final artistic product.
So let me put it this way, a bit blunt. Either we say that every worker has the same right as a worker, then there are special conditions, salaries, negotiation. Or we say that there is a category of workers that is more entitled than the others to have something. I think that this is a huge mistake that is behind the Statut d'Artiste. It's a serious problem. Because one of the weaknesses of these people is that you don't ally with the others, supposing that there are rights that are everyone's rights. They need to be acknowledged or recognized to a special category. You're right, it's not a special, it has to be specific. And if you make it through a channel that is even labeled as such, you make it special. That's the point I have, and I think the conversation has to be, you know, more fruitful, because we can take a position and say, okay, sorry the language, fuck everybody else. We need to protect us because we are the sector, or we don't say that, and then there are consequences. Sorry.
Okay, 1 minute if someone wants to answer, address these topics, and we're off.
I think what you have said is having a very blinkered view on how we talk about it. Because certainly in Ireland we don't want to be special, we are talking about workers' rights. The pilot scheme is actually seen as a pilot scheme for all workers. If we manage to do it for artists, we should be able to do it for everybody else. So you have an audience here, we are gathered here to talk about the artist. Yeah, you know, we can expand it out and we can start talking about every worker in the European Union and worldwide. And, you know, I don't think we'll get very far, but if we can focus in on our competence area and show that it can work in our competence area, then we can actually start showing how it can work outside of our areas of competence. And that's the approach that's been taken in Ireland.
Yes. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Estamos.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're completely out of time. Thanks for the generosity of giving us the extra time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you to you all for being here, and that the rights of cultural workers are going to help advance the rights of all workers. And I look forward to seeing you all at 5 o'clock in the workshop in El Molino. Thank you very much.